staff room, not only joking. I'm delighted to be asked actually, because this is new-ish material. The guilt side of it I've kind of kicked around before. The shame stuff is new and slightly underdeveloped, I think, in terms of Irish literature. And it's part of a kind of project that I'm working on, a kind of bridging project between Irish studies and what's called economic humanities, which people seem to attach some word for the humanities these days, for environmental and digital, but economic is a new one that isn't really part of the discourse of Irish studies. So this is kind of tentative step in that direction. One of the other aspects of the project, which I don't really have time to talk about, is just alluded to here in this kind of quotation by Joshua Clover, the academic and poet Joshua Clover, who talked about credit as a kind of time travel into spending in the present, the value of labour still in the future. Debt equally is the thing that knows what you'll be doing next summer. There's an element of time attached to all of this. You know, we feel guilt for things we've done, but that guilt carries forward into the future, particularly in relation to the guilt of indebtedness. The shame as well is more personal, the shame for past actions, shame for failings that we carry with us into the future. So there's a temporal element to the project as well that I'm not really going to talk about, but I wanted just to allude to briefly. As I said, at a global level, there are a plethora of critical interventions on the nature of credit, debt, economies within culture and philosophical studies. They've appeared since late 2008. And they illuminate ways in which the kind of overexposed, over-indebted neoliberal subject has become one of the most representative figures of financial capitalism. And in literary terms, there's a whole continuum there of really narrow and limited narrative expositions and condemnations of financial capitalism to much more complex and experimental literary work that I think is much more on the money, so to speak. Of particular relevance, current debates then are the ways in which these engagements with the genealogies and the politics of debt and their relation to modern subject formation intersect with recent and ongoing representations. That's another kind of scene we could talk about, representations of Irish economic affluence and subsequent experiences of austerity. And it's important to say that it's experiences of austerity. It's not just one experience of austerity. And there isn't just one experience of indebtedness either. I don't give that impression, but again, that's something I don't really have time to go into. As I said, there's a lot of work in the international sphere, whether it's in the social sciences, links between social sciences and cultural studies on debt. Anthropology will be another field in which debt and culture, or debt is seen as part of culture. Religious studies as well, of course, is very, very interested in not just guilt and shame, but also debt. Redemption and saving are key terms that border both religion, finance, and anthropology. But Tyed Mahmoud has a very good essay on debt and discipline in the American Quarterly, where he writes that throughout history, debt both lubricated circuits of value extraction and acted as a disciplinary device. I think we can all relate to that. One of the key ways, of course, that Thatcher destroyed the unions in the UK was giving everybody credit cards. That's how you get somebody into debt. They're unlikely to go on strike. From Athenian debt bondage to contemporary labour trafficking, debt peonage has been part of labour management regimes and a variety of modes of production. The historical role of debt in moral discipline is evidenced by the fact that in all Indo-European languages, words for debt are synonymous with those for sin, guilt. We see this there on when we look at Nietzsche's work. For Mahmoud, among others, debt is a fraction of Michel Foucault's theorisation of contemporary systems of governmentality, through which neoliberalism forms and, of course, regiments subjectivity. Debt, like so much else under the current political-economic conjuncture, is privatised as both material and an affective experience. And it's the affective thing that I'm looking at today. Of course, you can't ignore the material consequences of debt inside it. But in the second essay, on the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche brings two of these terms, debt and guilt, into alignment. And he poses the following question. Have these genealogists of morality up to this point allowed themselves to dream even remotely that, for instance, the major moral principle of guilt surely derives its origin from the very materialistic idea of debt, surely, or the punishment developed entirely as repayment without reference to any assumption about freedom or lack of freedom of the will. Now, the framing terminology here is illuminating. Morality and materialism are seen to be rooted in the same idea. Nietzsche fleshes out the material experience of indebtedness with ethical consequence, and in turn with the capacity to influence, to direct, and ultimately to contour human subjectivity. And here, Again, I think it's relevant for our own experiences. We see the encroachment of the materialism of the debt economy onto the terrain of affect and emotion. And I think in some ways, as we'll see with Dermot Bolger's book, look at it in terms of shame, Ireland's effective response to the material consequences of indebtedness has been quite stunted, actually. But Nietzsche proceeds further. He spotlights a key feature of the morality of indebtedness. The production of the memory of that debt is very, very important. He writes, and I've emphasised these portions here, precisely here promises are made. Precisely here the person making the promise has to have a memory made for it. Precisely here, we may suppose, is a repository of hard, cruel, painful things. The debtor, in order to inspire confidence that the promise will be honoured, in order to give a guarantee of the solemnity and sanctity of his promise, in order to etch the duty and obligation of repayment into his conscience, pawns something to the creditor by means of the contract in case he does not pay, something that he still possesses and controls. For example, his body, his wife, probably not today, or his freedom or his life. Time and affect, emotion, labour in Marx's terms are given over. Your future is given over. The first highlighted section here references the notion of memory, but of course it really speaks to the future. You remember in the future. And this is the creation of what any theorists call future memory. The subsequent highlighted section, or portion here, reiterates the links between indebtedness and morality, specifically the invocation of conscience. But surely there are equal temporal considerations to this invocation of human conscience. There are recourses to precedents in any exercise of conscience. Thus time unites both memory and conscience in the active creation of a moral subject, in Nietzsche's view. Now Nietzsche's work it's a good prompt. It's a bit general, a bit universalizing, but I think it's a good prompt. More recently, the Italian sociologist, he's not a Peaky Blinder, Maurizio Lazzarato, has published two very good books. One, The Making of a Indebted Man, and the other, Governing by Debt. And there's always a delay because they're translated from French, but there's always a bit of a delay. And it applies, or it refracts the contemporary context through Nietzsche's work, through Foucault, through Deleuze and Guattari. But he calls this idea, and he builds on Nietzsche's work and creates this idea of, again, a very universalist term, the indebted man. But he echoes Nietzsche and situates morality and economic responsibility within a protracted historical continuum. And he writes, we are no longer the inheritors of original sin, but rather of the debt of preceding generation. And there's something about this, in terms of the Irish situation, about imprisoning our children in debt. There's something, I don't know, just really resonant about this set of ideas. He says that an indebted man is subject to a creditor-debtor power relation, accompanying him throughout his life, from birth to death. And it begs this question. David Graeber, who's a very influential anthropologist, has written a history of debt, a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And he poses the question in the opening pages, why should we pay back our debts? And it seems like a very flippant question, a very serious question that we need to think about. Why should debts be paid back? I'm not going to answer that. I've just taken out a mortgage, so I don't know what to talk. But Lazzarato operates here on two different temporal planes. The latter portion is confined to the limits of the human lifespan. The normative lifespan burdened by the power relations of the world. These relations are fundamentally and inescapably centered on the economic parameters of the debt economy. But the earlier point signals Lazzarato's interest in more extended historical patterns and introduces the notion of haunting to our consideration of the relationship between the subject and indebtedness. In a sense, we're not only shadowed and haunted by our contemporary debt relations, but we are legatees of previous cycles and relations of indebtedness. And if you think of the etymology, the French etymology of the word mortgage, the mort is debt. Death is built into the term mortgage, the death of the agreement. And there's something uncanny and Gothic about our economic relations in that respect. So there are these Gothic overtones, and we can bring them into consideration of the Irish landscape. There's obviously the ghost estates, zombie companies, zombie banks. All this idiom is, we kind of accept it at a superficial level, but it's worth digging down into it and theorising a bit more. And it's worth considering how the crash and the relative attributions, of course, of blame, guilt, and responsibility are processed generally, but in my case, how they're mediated culturally and artistically in the Irish context. So we'll move into the literature now. Claire Kilroy is a very, very fine writer. quite experimental actually, deceptively so in her fiction. But very important contemporary writer, particularly on the Celtic Tiger. And she's written this book, which she published in 2012, called The Devil I Know. And it's a kind of semi-Faustian, Gothic, big house novel, so it's a bit of generic mix. But it does combine this kind of straight literary realism on the surface with elements of genre fiction. And again, just as a side note, there's quite a lot of genre fiction being read, or the structures of genre fiction, like detective fiction, Gothic, supernatural, they're being resurrected or woven into the representations, the high literary representations of the economic crash globally, but also in Ireland. And this deals with the decline and the fallout, really, of the Celtic Tiger. It relates the events surrounding main character with this very ostentatious name, Tristram St. Lawrence, and his immersion in the kind of nether regions of the credit-debt economy at the start of the 20th century. Now, it's published in 2012, it's set in 2016, of course, which has symbolic resonance. And the references to, we're celebrating the 1916 Rising, but the banks are actually running the country. We've lost our sovereignty on the centenary of our most notable historical rising. So Tristram has lived abroad for a while. He returns and he encounters one of his old schoolmates, who appears to be a bully, Des Hickey, who unveils Tristram into partnering in a very ambitious, outsized and unrealistic property investment. Tristram's decisions, indeed his agency, and this is important for the kind of the structure. One of the things I just want to get across is the way in which realism is tested by finance. How do you write about algorithms? How do you write about these forms of deception, these forms of complexity? And I think it can be done, but I think in the Irish context, the straight literary realist responses to the Celtic Tiger are very dull, plodding, and pedestrian. Okay, that was my opinion. Whereas Kilroy, and it's not necessarily science fiction, it's not hugely experimental, but she does have this kind of generic promiscuity in the way that she writes, which I think is a kind of, in Eliot's terms, a kind of objective correlative to the difficulty of grasping reality under these economic conditions. So the whole thing is combines various narrative devices, right? So the basic structure is Tristram is giving evidence to an inquiry. So it's a legal allegory almost, a legal setup. And he's responding in the first person to these questions. And in that way we learn the story. But one of the other characters mentioned in the book is a Monsieur Deauville, okay? And we never meet him, but he's Tristram's AA sponsor. Of course, Deauville, Devil, Faust, there's a whole kind of raft of things going on here. He's only contactable remotely by phone. So this impersonal advisor. Again, you can see the Faustian, you can also see in terms of the anonymous broker, the anonymous financial mechanisms going on here. And it's these sorts of narrative devices that Kilroy transcends the conventions of literary realism and invests the narrative with some Faustian textures. There's also the use of first-person focalization, which is important because that kind of, again, I don't have your time to go into it, but it just evokes the idea of risk. First-person decision, first-person testimony, risk, ambiguity, contingency are very much obvious when we deal with these first-person narratives, and they're there in other Celtic Tiger texts as well. As I said, the core narrative framework is that of a legal trial, and of course this explicitly coheres our focus on guilt and debt, form and shame. In addition to this form, the court trial, the novel incorporates elements of the Gothic, the Kafkaesque, and the Irish big house narrative as well, because Tristram's own house and land are basically hawked for the investment that Hickey advises him on, and eventually, of course, fails. And it can also be housed within, and this is a newly emergent genre. We all get these new genres emerging. The credit crisis novel. There are international surveys that don't include Irish texts for some reason in this credit crisis, this new credit crisis genre. So the narrative of The Devil I Know is unmoored really from a strictly realist account of Tristram's dealings and actions, and in a sense this is Kilroy's acknowledgement of the legitimacy of engaging with both the fictions of finance and financial fictions. So she's saying that finance is uncertain, it's fictional. Economics is a fiction, it's a story, it's uncertain. Therefore, how do we write about that? Well, then we must experiment, we must be contingent, we must be arbitrary almost, and experimental in how we write about that. So it's a kind of traffic between the two forms of fictionalization. And I'm just going to go quickly, again, I'm not going to go too long, I'm going to go quickly to the end of the novel, because I think this is a good epitome of what Kilroy is at. So, towards the end of the novel, he returns to this ancestral home, this Anglo-Irish seat, okay, that he's inherited and really destroyed. He describes the scene of aftermath that presages his imminent fate. Tristram's home belongs, as I've said, to the architectural and novelistic genealogy of the Irish Big House, which was, of course, in literary terms, an end-of-empire literary form. So she chooses this end-of-empire literary form, this literary form that was basically based on anxiety. You know, Big House is always based on anxiety. And that temperamental link, and that effective link across the genre, across history, I think is telling in terms of the decline of the Celtic tiger. The Big House, of course, was an edificial assertion of colonial seizure and power, transformed here into a scar of the landscape, which is again a reminder of the current situation. It manifests in a Gothic fashion as the dissolving remainders of a once aristocratic family, as well as the persistent and ghostly haunting form of people and memories from that fading landscape on the Irish, from the fading presences on the Irish landscape, make occasional appearances. So Tristan's father is there, but he's kind of ghostly figure. There's a gardener that we don't know if he's dead or alive. So there's this kind of spectral nature attached to the house as it's being, I suppose, finally sold off and destroyed. The Big House then is a mouldering incarnation of the unpaid debts of Ireland's colonial history. In this respect, the anteriority of the Big House narrative strand and the attendant violence and the insecurity of the genre historically anticipates the narrative we're dealing with and anticipates the imminence of the Faustian plot's resolution. What was once secure, superficially, what once appeared assertive, what once appeared unquestioning, and you could say, is that the Big House or is that the Celtic tiger? They both seemed assertive, they both seemed secure. They're both shown to atrophy in the presence of the duration of the novel. And this is how it's described. This is how the castle is described. And again, you can make a kind of switch of gear here and think about this as almost like a metonymic of the island of the Celtic tiger. I crossed the road to the Rue Collins to the castle entrance. Sir Tristram Hassoncourt re-arrived. That's a quote there, that's an element of, again, I'm not going to go into it. There are echoes of Joyce here, and historical repetition, specifically in Finnegan's Wake, because the first line of Finnegan's Wake and the last line of Finnegan's Wake actually are circular, they complete each other. Windows were broken and roof slates missing, a woodlea sprouted from the chimney stack of the garden was a poisonous ragwort thatch. The gatekeeper's cottage was a derelict wreck, and so was I. I went round the back. The castle was boarded up like the rest of the country. Or county. I paused, that should be country probably. I paused at the tradesman's entrance, but continued around to the vandal's entrance and climbed through that instead, seeing as I was the biggest vandal of them all. This is a quintessential site of dereliction, a fragmented and anachronistic edifice whose original purpose and proprietors have been superseded by the Gothic excesses of Celtic Tiger Ireland, and of course the workings of Ireland's integration into globalised liberal capitalism, and of course the debt credit Ireland. The boarded up reference here is an explicit invocation of the blight of ghost estates, and poignantly signals Tristram's ultimate alienation from history. From a character perspective, he is alienated from history. He's cast out by history, he casts away his own history in this transaction that he engages in with Des Hickey. His inheritance has been rendered as a dilapidated legacy to future generations. Again, there's elements and echoes there of guilt and debt. Along with the partially completed and now redundant site in which he and Des Hickey had planned to erect their hotel apartments. But the debt still must be met in the future. In figuring himself as a derelict wreck, Tristram internalises the dereliction of the country and of his ancestral home. But it's also suggestive of the ways in which debt is internalised and is formative of the process of subjectivation. So the internalisation of dereliction is the internalisation of debt, the guilt, the feeling of and the physical and psychosomatic feelings of debt. Echoing Nietzsche in Lazzarata, The debt economy is not confined to external physicalities, but performs work in hailing and forming the modern subject. So there are physical manifestations as we've seen, but we also need to be mindful of the more pernicious effective consequences of the debt economy. And it's such thoughts in mind that Kilroy draws the narrative to its resolution, with the Faustian pact made by Tristram bringing his life and his career to an end. Speaking about the trials and excesses of Tristram, a character referred to as the historian. And this is where we get, in fact, it's Mr. de Deauville, it's the devil, who summarises Tristram Faust's actions and his downfall at the very end of the novel. Again, there are obviously gaps in what I've said, but again, you can see here the attention to time, responsibility, settlement of debt. The benighted fool had squandered everything you see, every last farthing and more besides. What past generations had laboured to create, destroyed, just like that. The historian clicked his fingers, the whole way of life gone. He racked up a debt that can never be settled. But a debt must be settled, mustn't it? Isn't that the nature of debt? Deauville had come to collect. A debt must be settled. That is the nature of a debt. The devil linked my arm and began our descent. So we get two speakers there. We get the devil, we get the Faust, we get Monsieur Deauville, and we get Tristram. But also, we get Kilroy posing these questions. Debt must be settled, mustn't it? Isn't that the nature of debt? There's a problematization of debt here as well. These sections that are italicized there and underlined, they tally with the trope of decline seen earlier, from the decline of the Anglo-Irish, from whom Christian is derived, to the eminent decline of the property merchants of contemporary Ireland. But the other highlighted sections suggest that while the edifices and wealth of individual owners and speculators in any given historical period are transient and vulnerable, debt endures, and that requirement endures that it be paid in the future. I think the insistent pairing of debt and settling is noteworthy. The etymological origins in Old and Middle English of settle are associated with place, sense of rootedness or rest. Thus this adds a spatial layer to our already well-established temporal reading of debt. But equally, there is a questioning of the inevitability of the so-called nature of debt. As we currently live and understand it, debt does outlast us. It supersedes our actions, it guides our actions, and it informs our creation as subjects. Anyway, I'll leave debt there for a minute and move on to another cheery subject. Shame. Now, as I said, there's a lot more to think about in terms of debt and guilt in other Irish fiction, but also in contemporary Irish poetry as well, about the performance of affluence and how this is a postponement of inevitable pain and suffering in many ways under austerity. Now, Elspeth Probert is a very, very accomplished and influential feminist critic, but she's written this very interesting book. It is a monograph, but it has a kind of essayistic feel as well on blush, Faces of Shame. And part of it is to do with Australia and how the Australian government apologised to the Aboriginal people about the years and years of violence and genocide. And the way in which shame can be cynically co-opted by institutions through apologies. That shame becomes such a public thing, such a widespread thing that actually loses all its force. But it's an interesting book. Anyway, she touches on some ideas of shame. And she says, shame makes us feel small and somehow undone. It's no wonder that most society shame tends not to be talked about, let alone vaunted. Shame lingers deep within itself. Being shamed is unlike being in love. And she makes a distinction here, of course, between guilt. You're guilty because of your actions. So Tristram acts in a certain way. Ireland acted in a certain way, or certain people in Ireland acted in a certain way. Shame is about your global self. You're some inherent quality. It's harder to shake. It's harder to shake the feeling of shame in comparison to guilt in Proben's view. And she draws a lot of her work on or from Sylvan Tompkins, whose work has been gathered together by Eve Sedgwick and Ellen Frank in this book, Shame and its Sisters. And Tompkins believes that shame is integral to our humanity. And when it's triggered, it shows most clearly humanity in its frailty. But it's this emphasis on shame and humanity that maybe there's a root of positivity and potentially political action to be taken in the kind of discourse of shame. And they're fractions, and shame is a fraction, of course, of what's called the affective dimension of the transmission of cultural values. So shame is a way of transmitting cultural values, what we deem as important, what's legitimate, what's moral, what's immoral, what can be sanctioned, what isn't sanctioned. So it's part of that armoury. Probin goes on, she says, the shame of the cultural outsider is fed by a deep desire to fit in. So we try to fit in with the morally consented to view, and an abiding interest in being able to do so, to belong where you don't belong. But at this juncture of place, self and interest can produce a particularly visceral sensation of shame. It is felt in the rupture when bodies can't or won't fit the place, when seemingly there is no place to hide. Now, I'm not making, well I am, but I'm taking a sidestep, without making facile analogies between people and nations. There is a sense, and I've been thinking about this and talking to people about this idea of the national community, the imagined community that Benedict Anderson talks about in terms of nationalism. I think it's worth thinking about this idea, or making a comparison between an imagined community of shame in post-Celtic Tiger Ireland. That is there a sense in which media, discourse, literature, social media try to generate an imagined community of responsibility and shame about the excesses, about that party line, we all partied. And again, it seems like a throwaway line, but actually has some serious consequences because it's simply not true for a start. But can we make analogies between the aggregated Irish experiences of economic boom and bust that might warrant an investigation in terms of Probin's theorisation of shame effects, particularly this idea of the transmission of cultural values at a particular time, a time in history, of course. Shame, if we read Kafka at the end of the trial, Kafka makes a reference to shame as being inherent to humanity's social interaction. Walter Benjamin reads Kafka in the same way. So shame is social and socializing. This raises the prospect that shame effects can be employed and recast in less oppressive and self-destructive modes. Can we rethink the shame of Celtic Tiger excesses, so called, in ways that are not self-harming and that don't commit us to repetitive and damning self-denigration, as well as largely political apathy because we don't feel we're worthy of acting in certain political ways? Are we content to digest singular patterns of individual and national shaming, while remaining devoid of the appetite for meaningful protest against our destructive shame by our own government, for instance, by exogenous political and economic agents? Are we happy to do that? And there is writing out there on that. One actually, Ashley O'Donnell used to work here, didn't she? Mm-hmm. Ashley's written a very good essay on shame. She in a journal called the Deleuze Studies. She draws on Gilles Deleuze's work, and it's actually, I mean, I haven't worked through it fully, but it's actually builds. I think she does quote Probin, but it builds on this kind of idea. And she talks about the productive politics of desire in this essay, Shame and Revolution. She says, if shame reveals our inability to be solitary, which it does, isolated, atomic or disconnected, it can help to counter the individualism of liberalism and capitalism without falling prey to the nihilism of fascism by operating at the level of desired effect. It begins with the moment that one sees the intolerable. In this respect, shame has the potential to be a proto-political, proto-ethical affect because it suspends and precludes the ready invocation of cliches and explanations. Again, there's elements here of Primo Levi's work on shame and the Holocaust as well, about the feeling shame at the actions of others, feeling shame at your own reaction. It can be negative, but there's also the seed of communality and solidarity embedded within it. And I think that's what Ashley O'Donnell is talking about here. She draws on Deleuze, and Deleuze sees shame as a less stable emotion. Deleuze is deeply critical of emotions because he sees them as definitional, and he's much more interested in configurations of affects rather than these singular emotions. Deleuze's politicization of effect is consistent with his critique of static emotional gestures. Emotion is party to the delimited representational logic of capitalism and reason. The effective intensity of the shaming experience, instead of being read as debilitating and isolating, is legible as a seedbed for the aforementioned politics of desire. It's disruptive, potentially subversive, and might challenge the narrative presence. The intense experience is a moment, or what might be called a condition of possibility. And this is where Ashley O'Donnell elaborates on this some more. She says, instead, a politics of desire requires disruption at the level of affective life in order to create a space for different ways of seeing, perceiving, and thinking. Shame can be a precipitative force for both art and thought. as it interrupts, however briefly, the stupidities, cruelties and cliches that foster insensibility, indifference to life, to possibility and to becoming. Now, I think it's very interesting work about shame, particularly in the Irish context, because, for instance, when I mentioned to my forces I'm giving a lecture this afternoon on shame, they giggled nervously. Why do Irish teenagers, 20-year-olds, do that? There's something atavistic about this association with shame. And I think this kind of work that draws on Deleuze and Guattari, and Deleuze draws on Primo Levi to an extent, and more Benjamin, it might be relevant to the Irish context. Now, Ashton Donald refers to the stupidities, cruelties and cliches. This, for me, is a cliche. Dermot Bolger is a fine writer, but he tends to bring a bazooka to knife fights. He tends to be blunt. He can write, or might criticise him, he's a very accomplished writer in many respects. But this, and he published this is his own press, New Island Press, and he published another book. He facilitated the publication of Peter Cunningham's book, Capital Sins, which is also an extremely blunt confrontation with the Celtic Tiger. There are bad guys, and there are good people. And it's all very obvious from the start who they are and what's going to happen. That doesn't get us anywhere. We know this already. Okay? In this novel, as we'll see, and we'll look at it very briefly, shame is used in cliched ways. Shame is used in ways that we're already used to. It doesn't add anything. It tells a story that we're familiar with, and the people who are bad and greedy get their comeuppance. This is not a very interesting kind of way to deal with the Celtic Tiger. And even within literary realism, there are interesting ways to deal with the Celtic Tiger, but this isn't one of them. And now that I've whetted your appetite for it, we'll talk a little bit about it. So, it's a strictly realist text. It's got a very unsophisticated moral in its narrative, and it misses an opportunity, as of moving from Ashton Donald's work to Elspeth Probe into this. It misses an opportunity here. He confronts shame. He uses shame as a narrative device, and in that sense, it's still, even though it doesn't use shame in a constructive way, it's still actually useful because it prompts us to say, well, that's not very useful. What is useful? And it kind of rehashes ideas and arguments that we're already used to. It's Dublin-centric in its geographical context, South Dublin, and it circulates around the outer edges and closing stages of the Celtic Tiger. So it doesn't deal with people. It doesn't deal with big, massive property developers. It deals with normal people who are a little bit greedy, but you get a sense that they're representative of something else. They're self-absorbed. The narrative is scored with shame, Irish religious shame, moral shame, family shame, betrayal, gendered crises, and but you always sense it's working its way towards some form of resolution, some form of redemption. Just don't know where it's going to come, but it's going to come. And it comes in a very obvious and I just think flat kind of way. It's a kind of representative tale from the annals of the Celtic Tiger, and it's, as I said, its relevance really is really continuing blame the Irish, blame them. That's what we do. But we're introduced to the central married couple, Chris and Alice, and their marriage is under a bit of strain. Chris is trying to get on the property ladder. They have a reasonably fine house in South Dublin, but they want a bigger house, and he's always failing at auctions. Okay, and he feels shame for this. Alice feels shame because she was brought up in a very religious household. Okay, so we're ticking all the boxes here. Chris is fated to fail by agencies outside of his control, bigger property developers. He's racked with worry about the financial implications of success, but he's equally wrapped in a cycle of shame and guilt centred on his inability to acquire a statement property for his dependent wife. And in a sense also, and this could be another avenue of investigation, his anxiety stems from what Bulger paints as the masculinization of the Celtic Tiger economy. He brings in this trope of impotency. Chris is taking Viagra and he fails at auctions. I mean, I don't need to be literally of high merit to figure that one out. But again, shame comes into it in various ways. Now, he has this ongoing feud with his neighbour Ronan, who used to be Alice's boyfriend at school, but they patch things up. Now, Ronan's marriage collapsed because he's a bit of a boy-o player. But Ronan and Chris patch things up, and they're going to build something that straddles both their properties, right? We'll talk about that in a moment. But shame is introduced in Ronan's life, and Ronan is portrayed to us. So we see Chris, he's ashamed of his own impotence in all sorts of ways. Alice is suffering from some kind of, trauma of her upbringing in an ultra-Catholic house where her father showed no love and all this sort of stuff. Ronan's, which is more interesting, is on foot of his breakdown of his marriage. He's remarried a much younger and hyper-sexualized Filipino nurse, but he's still addicted to pornography. Okay, and shame comes again in like an elephant into the room in describing Ronan's nighttime activities. Ronan was not trying to find something, but momentarily to lose something himself. These sights let him cruise in a comfort zone, an addict whose conscience and bothersome moral compass was switched off. These images were heart-numbingly intimate and utterly impersonal. Amateur home shot galleries provided glimpses into mundane, bizarre lives, a network of loneliness with everything revealed and nothing felt, with judgment suspended and emotion numbed by the public manifestation of intimacy these couples needed to display. So what we get here is a sequence of negations and absences. Bulger once more configures the emotional experience of his character through that which is fractured, that which is alienated. From Ronan's personal self-alienation to the figuration of these participants in his pornographic world as a network of loneliness, emotion is siphoned away through shared isolation. The internet clamours with sexual explicitness to which Ronan retires each night, but it's a domain of discreet exhibitionism and exploitation. Ronan's private indulgence in pornography, his entry into an anonymous virtual world, seems to contrast to the ways in which he conducts his public business affairs, where he's quite assertive. The apparent abjection of his private addiction appears as a contradiction of the assertive imprints he leaves on his property investment. He muses, again, this is the same section, or relatively right. Maybe he was two different people. When among other men his competitive impulses kicked in, he was the competitor with a side bet on every hole in golf, the golfer who would sell his soul to win a close-to-the-pin contest. People thought they knew him even if they didn't always like him. In the public world, winning and losing was clear-cut, but alone at his computer he was robbed of every persona he adopted with outsiders. So the idiom here is scored with references to division, alienation, and fracture, thereby reinforcing the self-destructive, self-alienating version of shame to which the author is wedded. And this is what happens to the protagonists in the novel. They're all isolated over the course of the novel. That's what shame in its oldest form is supposed to do, make you feel bad about yourself. Okay? You're isolated because the community has judged you. I mean, there's two things there really, isn't there? You're isolating and critiquing and ashamed of yourself because the community has judged you. You're aware of people judging, but you feel isolated from them. You feel something wrong with yourself. And each of these characters feels that at different stages. And in a sense, what Bulger is doing, he's making a link between the private and the public. The implication is by Bulger is there's very little separate conventional notions of pornography and the materialistic self-gratification of wealth and property under the Celtic Tiger. Again, you look at shorthand, property porn and all that sort of stuff that circulated during that time. In the context of the novel, Ronan's shame at his secret online voyeurism is analogous to the way in which the broader experiences and legacies of the Celtic Tiger experiences of self-alienating shamelessness or shamefulness are evident at the sharp edges of its aftermath. Now, as I said, the two main male characters, Ronan and Chris, set aside their differences and they're building this illegal property extension or building, and they're going to sell it on and make a profit. They don't have permits. They're using, unregistered labour. What happens is a workman has a heart attack and he dies at the site at night. They don't know he has a heart attack. They think he fell and died, so they have to get rid of the body. And it goes through this whole cycle. They go to Dublin Mountains and they bury the body. And there's always Gothic elements of Gothic there, but they think that they're in trouble, basically. As it turns out, he had a heart attack, and Ronan's wife, who happens to be a nurse, goes down, unbeknownst to them thus far, and tries to resuscitate him. Can't do that, but then retreats and lets the lads respond, and she wants to see how they respond. And already you see, here we go. The foreign voice in the novel is going to tell the Irish how bad they are. Okay? And this is a feature of other Celtic Tiger novels as well. The Irish are to blame. That's not necessarily, I don't think anyway, the correct literary response. So, Kim is, as I said, she's hypersexualized in the novel at various points. She's portrayed as exotic, sexually alluring, but she transcends all of that to become the kind of moral voice and the moral compass in the novel. And it's not to say that somebody from outside Ireland can't point this out, but it's just so blunt in the novel. And of course, again, she's given this set piece, and this is only part of it, where she's humiliating and shaming her husband, and then she turns to Chris. Okay, so it's all very stage managed in a way, and it's quasi-religious, actually, very religious in certain parts in the rhetoric. My Christ is a carpenter with weathered hands. He told me there was nothing I could do for the workman, but I could do something for myself and my husband. I could lead the body where I found it to discover the true nature of the man I married. I could set a test to make Ronan take responsibility. I had seen the safety inspector close down this site and knew that when Ronan found the body, he would blame the loose scaffolding. But if he found the courage not to duck and dive, an autopsy would clear him of blame and prove that the scaffolding played no part. That man could have died in his bed. I was longing to go down and confess, but my God instructed me not to interfere in this test to see into the soul of the man I have wed. Again, it's really shoveled on. You know, she's this. Yeah, unfortunately, but she's this exogenous. She's this voice of judgment. Okay, looking in on these misguided Irish people. Okay, and I'm not saying Irish people are misguided, but it's just the way that it's presented. She's morally elevated. Her religiously grounded exploitation of a man's death to test her husband's integrity doesn't gainsay her primary moralizing role in the text. Not only does she question and highlight Ronan's moral weakness, in this instance, she also then turns to Chris and she interrogates him as well. Chris has seen this happen. He's watching Ronan be, morally divested by his wife, and he takes umbrage. Why didn't you tell us? How come I didn't see you? Or how come I didn't see the body? And then she turns to him and she says, well, he asked this question. Why didn't I see the body when I came out? And then she says, you were too busy peeping up at my lit window like a guilty schoolboy as you urinated against a tree. You were so eager for a flash of bare thigh that you missed the sight of Ronan quietly dragging the body across our lawn to deposit it on your property, transferring the problems onto your shoulders. So they're both they're both responsible for trying to bury the body, but this is, you're a perv as well. So her objectified sexuality becomes a prism through which she views these culpable Irish property entrepreneurs. The ways in which she's reductively perceived and judged in Bulger's moral scheme reveal more about the superficial desiring gaze of Celtic consumerism. And her reference in the previous quotation to the fact that he was peering up at her like a peeping Tom also can be used as a metaphor. It's kind of moral blindness as well. He's not looking where he should be looking, and people weren't looking where they should be looking. And in the end, as I said, she becomes this very obvious, very singular beacon of grounded morality and clear-sighted integrity in Tanglewood. And the problem really is that the whole ethical structure of the novel is so unsophisticated that it really cannot be any realistic guide or insight into the Celtic tiger. It's too universal, it's too simplistic. And in other ways, of course, it takes all responsibility away from the Irish, in other words, because they don't have to work their way through the shame. They have it pointed out to them. You actually don't have to take any responsibility for your actions because somebody else will tell you what's wrong with you. That's not a profitable way. And I don't think that's what Aisling O'Donnell is trying to say in her reading it to lose either. So I'm going to finish now anyway. So I think what I'm gesturing towards is that is first of all, at the broad level, is the relevance of kind of interdisciplinary approaches, looking at how literature, culture, philosophy are, and need to be relevant to, looking at economics, because economics is not a science. Economics is cultural. It's contextual, despite what practitioners might say. Also, it shows the potential of looking at theories of affect when we talk about economics, because economics depends on affect, depends on desire, depends on choice, on wants. not just on needs. And not just those, but also the fallout of the Celtic Tiger as well. And it also, as we've seen, and there are many more different examples, on the problematic and contrasting ways in which writers have responded to the Celtic Tiger. Some very linear, obvious ways, others much more experimental ways. Paul Murray's novel, The Mark and the Void, is completely postmodern in how it approaches the Celtic Tiger, which I think is a much more appropriate way to do it. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.